Hi, welcome to Quilting with Lori. Today we are on part 4 of our Snow Village Sew Along, and this is a Snow Village pattern that I did a few years ago. This time I am making my Snow Village quilt in lavenders and pinks, and I just grabbed stash from fabrics from my stash. I always love to shop my own stash when I'm creating quilts. So today we're going to learn part 4, and that is paper piecing this pine tree block. And it's an easy technique. I'm going to share that with you. If you have already registered for this class, which is out on my website, quiltingwithlori.com, you go to the shop and scroll down to the courses. This is the Snow Village course. You can register for the whole thing. You can register at any time. This course, all of its videos, everything will remain permanently on my site and on my YouTube channel. So you can always finish the quilt at your leisure. And if you are registered as a student or if you are a member of my Block of the Month YouTube video, then you'll get the pattern as well as the templates. They'll be emailed to you, so you should already have those by the time I post this. And so today we're going to learn how to put this block together. I'm going to make 4 of them. The pattern only calls for 2, but I only made a couple of my snowflakes. I think I made 4 snowflakes instead of 6. And so now I want to make a couple of extra pine trees. Have fun with this pattern. Make it yours. If there's some different things you'd like to include in blocks, go ahead and do that. This is your quilt. Have fun. Now, let's get started. All right, I have a lot on my tabletop here, but this is actually, there's a couple of pine tree blocks that I have finished here. And as you can see, I've done my sky is in a lavender, and my pine tree, I've taken a dark purple batik and a pink batik with white circles in it, and that's my snow. And then, of course, I used a darker purple for the tree trunk. There it is right there for you. Make sure you can see what I'm referring to. All right, now, here is the pattern. It's a 1-page pattern. It gives you the measurements on the different fabrics that you need to cut from the snow, from your sky, and from the dark for the pine tree. So these are the fabrics that you need to cut, and I don't have the tree trunk. It's over here on the side. I'll grab those as well. These are 2.5-inch squares that you'll need for the tree trunk. And so that's what you need. And the cutting instructions here are for 2 blocks. In my case, I've already made 2, and I'm cutting using the same cutting instructions for 2 more blocks because I personally am making 4 of these. And now let's take a look at the paper template that you would have received. It is 4 pages. And as you can see, there are guidelines, which means you have to tape this together. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. So this is page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. And you just follow those guidelines and tape all 4 pages together if you'd like. Or you can loosely cut around the elements, like loosely cut around the pine tree, loosely cut around these side pieces that are the triangular side pieces that are the sky. So, and then just put them together with using the guidelines and tape. Either way works beautifully. And so let me show you what I have done here. I have cut mine apart. Here is cutting them apart loosely before taping the pages together. So let me show you this. So here, is the pine tree that I can easily tape together. I'm going to use the guidelines. There are these lines here. I'm going to cut on one guideline there so that it's right on the guideline, and then tape it exactly to its neighbor. I'll cut on these bottom guidelines here and tape them exactly to its neighbor on the bottom, and the same way over here. And that way you'll have a full pine tree that you'll be using. In this case, I had actually taped the whole the pages together. All 4 pages were taped together, and then I just loosely cut out the pine tree around it. Either way, you can cut them individually, loosely tape them together, or tape the 4 pages together and then loosely cut around it. Whichever, it doesn't matter. All right, couple of things. When you print off your template PDF for the paper piecing, be sure you print it at 100% so that it is the correct size. Printers often like to default to fit to page. That will be too small. So each and every time you print a template PDF, make sure, double check that your printer is in fact printing it at 100%. So I'm using a paper scissors. Make sure you're using a paper scissors when you're doing this trimming. Got some Scotch tape here. I have trimmed on exactly on this guideline here and exactly on this guideline and the bottom guideline. Once I trimmed on this guideline, the number 5 got chopped off. So I wrote it right next to that. So I'll know that this element right there is a B5. And I'm simply going to take this bottom seam here, follow that guideline, and tape it exactly on this guideline. All right, then I'm going to tape this one right here. I cut it exactly on the guideline there. So B4 is matching up with B4 in the bottom. I'm taping that. Whoops. It works if I get the tape on there. All right. Now what I have done is I have trimmed on the guideline up and down this side, and I'm going to tape it exactly up against the guideline and its neighbor. And I will tape it. Now, if you're off a hair, no big deal. You'll simply be stitching straight lines, but get as close as you can. Okay, so I have my tree, and it's loosely cut out. There are 1/4 inch seam allowances all the way around, and I've loosely cut about another 1/4 of an inch around that so that I'm not cutting into the seam allowance at this point. We do need the seam allowance. That's important. So this tree is ready to be paper pieced. All right, you're going to see in your templates, there's an A3, A2, and A1 section. We're not going to have to worry about paper piecing these because these are simply two rectangles and a square that we're going to sew together as a unit. Very simple, so we don't have to worry about paper piecing those. So I'm just going to set those off to the side. That is this bottom section of the block, the sky unit, the trunk, and the sky. And they're just rectangles and a square, and I've given you the measurements in the pattern so you can simply just sew that unit together and it's ready to go. All right, that takes care of that one. Now, before we get to the tree, here are the top C1 and D1, and these are the sky units, and they're big triangles. What I have done, I've taped the little top sections to them because you need that, and then I've simply cut it right on the seam allowance line there because I am going to simply trace these two pieces onto the lavender fabrics here, the cut fabrics that we have ready to go, and you'll see that in a minute. So they are ready for me. I'll lay those aside and we'll get to those. Let's first of all work on the paper piecing. And the first thing that you need to do once you have it taped together is make some fold lines all the way across. So what I have done is every single line in the center of that tree has a fold line, a crease on it, which is going to make this so much easier to work with. Here's how you do that. I'm taking a long ruler. If you have those add a quarter rulers, a long one, that's fabulous. I don't have a long add a quarter ruler. I'll grab my shorter one and show you what I mean by that. So I'm just using a regular ruler. I'm lining it up right there on that seam line. And I'm bringing the paper up and I am scoring it here with my fingers right up against the ruler to create a nice crease. Now I'm going to go over. That was between B1 and B2. Now I'm going between B2 and B3, doing the same thing. And I'm going to go and do this across the entire tree here. There's between B3 and B4. I'm going to make another crease and make sure that is a nice crease there. And now I'm between B4 and B5, creasing it there. Okay. Next, and just 2 more left. between B5 and B6. And then between B6 and B7. All right. So these are both ready now for me to start paper piecing. All right, so I have pulled my dark fabrics for this pine tree, the pieces that I have cut, and my snow pieces that I have cut. And I'm working on 2 blocks. I think I'll be working on them at the same time. This is that add a quarter ruler that I was mentioning to you. I only have a 6-inch ruler, so it's just not long enough. The neat thing about these add a quarter rulers is that there is this lifted section in the back, which is the 1/4-inch seam allowance, and it butts right up to your paper. It allows you to cut away the excess fabric and retain a perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance. So they're wonderful to have. I am simply going to use my regular ruler and just make sure that I've lined up that 1/4-inch seam allowance on each end. And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. Another thing you'll want to do is use some pins to keep some of the fabric, the loose fabric, attached to the paper, or it will often flip under as you go to your sewing machine and you end up sewing the wrong pieces together. So just make sure that you have some way of securing it so that it doesn't flip under the stitching for you. You could even use a touch of glue just to keep everything intact. So I have laid, let me show you what I have done here. We are always working with the right side of the fabric away from us. And for this batik, it really doesn't matter. So the right side of the fabric is facing away from me. The wrong side is facing me. I am going to lay this unit, and I think I'm going to trim just a little bit of this excess paper away just so that you can kind of see. There, need that. And again, make sure you use a paper scissors when you're trimming the paper. All right, so what I want to do, and I'm leaving some excess purple fabric out here, and I am basically laying this B1, we're starting with B1, which is right here, at the bottom of this, making sure I can still see a little bit of the purple fabric coming through there. I am pinning it to secure it, so when I move this up to the sewing machine, I am not going to have that fabric flipping under and getting sewn into a seam allowance. So I've done this for both sides. Now, here's what we're going to do next. There is a lot of excess fabric under there, and we're going to remove that. We're going to create a seam allowance between B1 and B2. And we're simply going to fold back on that crease that we had created. We're going to line up our ruler so that there's a 1/4-inch seam allowance between the paper and this fabric. And I need to locate my cutter. Here we go. And we're going to cut away the excess. So that goes in my crumb stash. So there we go. And we'll worry about this part. This will get trimmed later. Right now, we're just going to leave it as is. Right now, we're only worried about trimming between B1 and B2 so that we have a perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing over here between B1 and B2. Perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance. All right, that goes to the crumb stash here. Whoops. There we go. All right, so that's all for attaching B1 at this point. Now we need to add B2 and stitch on that seam allowance. Here's how we're going to do that. For adding each unit now, as we continue up this pine tree, we're going to be working from the back. The fabric is always on the back, and you're always sewing on the front. There are other ways to paper piece. Some people love to paper piece without actually sewing through the paper, but today I'm going to be teaching you the technique where you're sewing through the paper. So here we've got B1 finished. He's ready to go. Now we've got to attach B2. I've actually attached B2 here by simply flipping it over, taking the size that I needed, and the pattern tells you what size and length, and lining it up beautifully to that seam allowance there. And then just to ensure that it extends up as far as we need it, when you crease it there on the next crease between B2 and 3, you can flip this up. And if I didn't have this pin here, you could tell that I have plenty of fabric to extend beyond this paper right here. That B2 has to extend way up into the B3 area just to make sure that you don't run out of fabric. And so I have pinned that. I'm going to take that to my machine here in a minute, and I am going to stitch on the stitching line between B1 and B2. And then I will have the pink snow and the purple attached. Then we're going to trim that up. Now let me show you how I actually did this. So I flip it over. I took the required size, find the right side and put right sides to right sides on this fabric. Center it across there because you want to make sure that when this flips up, it flips up far enough to cover the next triangle there. And so I have centered it, made sure that it will flip up and cover that next triangle. There should be plenty of fabric there for you. I'm going to go ahead and pin on each side. And then I'm going to take this to my sewing machine and I am going to stitch. I'm going to use a shorter stitch length. I'm going to sew from probably a 2.2 stitch length or even a 2. And that helps to perforate that paper there. I'm going to stitch right on that stitch line right up to this point where it ends. And then I'm going to come back and show you what I've done. And I'm going to show you how to trim up this pink so that it matches this right here. All right, I have gone to my machine and I've stitched from the corner here and I've stitched on that line all the way to the end of point of B1 and B2. And that's where I've ended my stitching and it's ready to go. I do like to immediately take it to my iron and press it back so there's no fold in the fabric. So it is pressed and now I can trim it. And of course I'm going to trim, I'm going to allow myself a 1/4 inch seam allowance between B2 and B3. So I'm simply going to fold this back, grab my ruler, line it up where there's the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and go ahead and trim that. And there we go. So there is B1, there is B2, all ready to go there. Now let's head over here. I've sewn again. I used a shorter stitch length, which helps to perforate the paper, and it just makes it easier to remove the paper. You can purchase paper piecing paper, which is really thin. It's fabulous. I have purchased that on EQ8, Electric Quilt Company's site, and I'll try and remember to link the resource to that because it is a much thinner paper and it just comes off so well. I simply made photocopies of this this is just regular copy paper, which works just fine. So now both of my units, this is B1 unit, this is B2. Now finished B1, B2, we need to add B3, and we'll simply flip this over, take the next rectangle of the sizes that the instructions told you to cut, center it across here to ensure that you're covering everything. And I do like to put a pin at each end just to ensure nothing moves as I move this over to my sewing machine, because it's very easy for it to flip away. That one's ready. I'm lining this up across the tree, centering it. And because I have a batik, there's really not a right side or a wrong side, but always make sure if you're using a regular quilting fabric that has a right side and wrong side, make sure that the right sides are always together, right sides facing when you're putting your fabrics down. Now I am ready to take this to my machine and stitch between B2 and B3 right on that line, and then I'll come back and trim again to get the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So let me do that, I'll bring it right back. I have B3 added. Now I need to trim away the excess so that there's just a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've got to do that on both of these. So I'm simply going to flip this over, turn it back on the B3 line right there. And take my ruler, allow for just 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. There we go. And we'll worry about this stuff on the outside edge and the bottom later. We're going to leave all of that for the time being. All right, here we go. I need to flip this over and find that B3 line there. And we will allow just 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. There we go. So now we have B1, 2, and 3 attached on both of these, B1, 2, and 3. Now we're back to B4, and it again is going to be pink. So let me grab that. I went to grab my pinks, which I had cut, but I noticed that these that I had trimmed away from the first one actually are going to work to fit over a section B4. So I'm going to use those, and I'll save the other rectangles for something else. So I'm lining that up, right sides together again on the back, center it across the bottom to make sure it extends all the way across. And I'm going to go ahead and pin these so it doesn't flip up. So I will take this to my machine and sew on the line between B3 and B4. And over here, let me make sure I got this on here right. Yes, I do. I'm again lining it up, centering it. I can see the paper lines here with the tree. You probably aren't able to see those, but I'm making sure that it's centered on the tree itself. And I'm going to simply pin both sides just so it doesn't flip up and I end up sewing it into the seam allowance. So now again, I'm going to sew on the line between B3 and B4. Between B3 and B4, and I'll be right back. All right, I've sewn the pink section on both, and it's already in the shape of a triangle because I used leftover pieces, but I still do need to trim up. I'm going to go to the B4, B5 line, flip it back, and I'm going to trim. Make sure that your pieces on the bottom are nice and flat. I always like to press them before I do this. And then take your ruler, and you're going to add 1/4 of an inch seam allowance between B4 and B5. Cut that away. And now it's perfect. Let's go over here. Again, it's in the shape of a triangle because I used a leftover piece, but I do need to trim that up, make sure that it's all nice and flat underneath there, that there's not a fold in the fabric. And then add 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, or trim it up to that, between B4 and B5. Voila. Okay, that's ready. Now the next one again is going to be dark purple, and we're going to be adding B5. Now we're adding the purple B5. And so I've flipped this one over, it's ready to go. I'm going to lay this, center it across the tree. I can see where the tree is in there and where this piece needs to land. So I've placed that there. I am going to pin each end just so that it doesn't flip up and get in the seam allowance there. I'm going to do the same here, right sides together, remember, and center it across the tree there. Pin each end. And now I'm going to stitch between B4 and B5 on that line on both of these, and I'll be right back. Now we are going to trim. I've finished placing that one on there. It's sewn on. I've pressed it up. I am going to now trim so that there is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance between B5 and B6. And again, a lot of this is going to be squared away later. We're not worried about that now. There's B5. And the excess can be used in your crumbs. All right, so these are now ready for the next piece, which is snow. And those snow pieces, again, you take the right sides together, lay it across the center of that tree, and I can see the tree outlined here. You probably can't. I'm making sure that I'm covering the entire thing. I'm pinning just the outside edges so it doesn't flip up and sew into the seam allowance. I'm going to do the same thing over here. Find the right side, right sides together, pin, pin. I'm going to take it over and stitch between B5 and B6 on both of these. All right, I have finished B6, pressed it away from the old line there, and now I'm going to trim between B6 and B7. Give it just a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. There we go. Do the same over here. There we go. Now the last piece is the purple. And I will again simply place it in here, right sides together, and make sure that you've centered it across the top of the tree. I can see that on that paper. You probably cannot. And there we go again. And I'm going to simply pin each side just so it doesn't flip. The other thing I learned with the two that I've already created is on this long piece here, you might want to just pin it down here as well, because one of mine flipped up and got sewn into the seam allowance, and I had to unpick that. So just pin it down there so it doesn't go anywhere. I'm going to go to the machine now and sew this last seam between 6 and 7. I'm going to get that stitched, and I'll bring it back and trim it up, and then we'll trim up the entire tree. I have the top purple unit on there. That is the B7 unit now, and I've pressed it. I like to press everything each time as I'm working with it to make sure there's no folds within any of these fabric seam allowances. So now I'm going to literally trim it up all around the unit, following that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm laying my ruler on the pine tree and doing a trim on the 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. I'm going to remove these pins. And then, of course, all of this paper is going to have to be removed as well. If you have grandkids, or maybe you can remove all of that while you're watching TV or something, but that does need to be removed. An easy way to remove it is just to take a Q-tip that's dampened and touch the seam allowances there that you've stitched, and that will help to remove that. It'll soften that paper right up. So let me go ahead and trim up this tree and show you how that's done. I'm simply going to trim it and allow that 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the pine tree. We need that 1/4 inch seam allowance so that we can sew the rest of the unit together. And there is the unit. I've trimmed up both of the pine tree units. I still have the paper on most of it here. For the tree trunk and the sky and the bottom, unit. That is simply the two rectangles and the square in the center. And that simply gets placed on there. You place it on the bottom. So the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that's what I have right here. So that is attached. Now what we are going to work on are the D1 and C1 units. And I'm simply, basically, they're identical in shape and size. So if you take the two fabrics that you have created and put them right sides together, these are the fabric sizes that are in the pattern that you need to cut. Go ahead and cut those to the right dimensions, put them right sides together, and then you only need to really use one of these. Place it on the unit, pin it down, and then you can trace it or use your rotary cutter and ruler and just simply cut around it. And then you have both D and C because you've got these right sides together. So you're creating a mirror image. So you can simply take your ruler and just very carefully cut it, cut out the template. And then you'll have, might even have two of these here. Let's see. So now this piece here is going to be sewn to that side, and this piece here is going to be sewn to that side. And it might be best if you leave the paper in as you sew these on. This is all bias here, and you could easily stretch that. So you might want to just leave the paper on the back of your tree and then just go ahead and place this on here and pin them so they match. Pin the bottom, pin the center here. Sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, flip it open and press, and then do the same on this side to create your unit. My pine tree blocks are ready to go for the quilt. I'm very excited. So next time we'll be able to literally put all of our blocks together in the quilt with our houses, with our snowflakes, and with our pine trees. I've made 4 pine trees. I only made 4 snowflakes. And then of course I made all 8 of our houses. Let me grab those. I'll lay them out here and you can see what they all look like. All of the snowflake blocks look like this in my snow, and I had gone shopping in my stash, and my snow is a pale pink with a white polka dot. It's a batik. And here are the 8 house blocks that I created. I don't know the numbers on these. They're all out of order, but just some great blocks that I can't wait to see put together in the quilt. Every house block is a little different. Some of them are schoolhouses, one is a church, one is an inn, one is a warehouse. Here's the warehouse. So I've got all of those ready, plus my pine trees. Next time we're going to be putting the quilt together with the borders. For part 5, which is coming up at the beginning of December, I'm going to be sharing with you how to put the whole quilt together. We'll piece all of blocks together and put the simple borders on. There's 2 small borders, inside and outside, and then a wider middle border. We'll be doing that. And then I'm also going to demonstrate for you how once you get your quilt quilted, you'll have to quilt it first. Then you're going to add the rhinestones for all of the snow on there. It's just a beautiful technique. And so you'll want to get some sort of a hot fix applicator. Mine is a Darris. It's called a rhinestone setter, a hot fix applicator. It looks like this. It's got a number of different parts and pieces that you can use. I think they're in this particular container here. For different size rhinestones that you might be attaching. I've got a lot of different size applicator tips. So that I keep in there, and I've got a couple of different size rhinestones that I'll be showing you how to apply. So we'll be working on that as well. It's going to be a beautiful quilt, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to get it pieced together and quilted, and then after it's quilted, you can do your hot fix applicator with your rhinestones. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time on part 5 for this quilt. Until then, happy quilting.